Okay, I found some of the most epic last stands in human history, starting with this man named Horatius. Alright, we're gonna talk about that one guy who saw a huge army heading to wipe out his city and thought, you know what, I'll just stay here and hold the bridge. No biggie. Rome, 508 BC, when the Etruscan king Lars Porsena showed up. Porsena is upset with Rome, and he's coming with his army to really confront them. But the Romans, they have a small issue. They barely have any defenses, aside from the Sublican Bridge, which isn't exactly the most remarkable building ever. It's a bridge, it's ancient, and it's a bit shaky. So when the Etruscans show up and the Romans are like, we don't really have a plan for this, Horatius stands there, cracks his knuckles, and thinks, yep, no problem. So what's his plan? He runs to the Sublican Bridge, the most important part of Rome's defense plan. He's saying, okay, this is it. It's time to protect the bridge like it's the only one left in the world. And behind him, his fellow soldiers, probably thinking that they should be doing more than just watching him, start to tear down the bridge. Horatius is still on the bridge. It's just him and a huge army. Yup. The Etruscans, led by Lars Porsena, probably thinking, is this guy for real? But no, Horatius is all in for the victory. He stands strong, sword ready, prepared to stop any Etruscan soldier who tries to come through. They give it a go. They put in a lot of effort. This guy's stopping a whole army from getting across a bridge all by himself. Take a moment to think about that. The bridge is slim, just wide enough for two guys to stand close together. But that's all he needs. Behind him, the shaking wooden boards go over the river Tiber, a weak link joining the city of Rome to safety. And in front, the enemy comes on strong, a loud, moving group of fighters ready for battle. It's a complete mess, and Horatius is right in the middle of it. But at last, what we all expected takes place. The bridge falls down, and Horatius, always the dramatic hero, looks around and thinks, well, this was fun. But I think it's time for plan B. And so, like a real action hero, he leaps off the bridge and into the river Tiber. And guess what? He swims to safety. And just like that, he turns into a sign of Roman bravery. And a sign of pointless stubbornness as well. Because who in their right mind thinks it's a good idea to take on a whole army by themselves to protect a bridge? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and outsmarted by simple reasoning. But come on, let's not act like Horatius didn't have some good luck on his side. Also, subscribe. Now, do it. The Battle of Shiroyama, September 24th, 1877. So, the samurai, these famous warriors with swords that you've absolutely heard of, had been a key part of Japan's military for many years. But then, Japan chose to change things up in the late 1800s, and all the fancy swords and detailed armor began to seem a little old-fashioned. But naturally, the samurai didn't agree. They weren't happy about being swapped out for new soldiers. So in 1877, the leader of the Satsuma clan, Saiga Takamori, chose to start a rebellion. At Shiroyama, there were many more enemies than samurai. We're talking about 5,000 samurai facing off against a Japanese imperial army of about 30,000 soldiers, many of whom were armed with modern rifles, while the samurai had swords. But hey, the samurai weren't famous for their strategy, they were famous for their honor and courage, and some really iffy life decisions. Seppuku. The fight happened in the Satsuma area of Japan, and by the time the samurai gathered on Shiroyama Hill, they were already clearly outnumbered and outmatched. The imperial army was fully stocked with cool new guns and cannons, etc. It was pretty terrifying to be a samurai, but the samurai stood strong, prepared to do what they did best, fight hard until the very end. Saigo Takamori, the brave leader, signaled for one final attack. Yeah, they were going to attack the significantly better armed and larger in size army. The morning air was thick with the sharp smell of gunpowder, as the imperial army, protected by their tidy lines of rifles, let loose a flurry of bullets. Neat lines, guns firing, and their leaders confidently believing this was a fight of numbers and machines. They just needed to stay in line and the samurai would fall apart, right? Wrong. Saigo Takamori stood in front of his men, his sword shining brightly, and he wasn't gonna let a few bullets spoil his day. As the bullets flew past him, he looked at the enemy, and then without a second thought, he lifted his sword and shouted something like, well, we're doing this, I guess, and then charged. The samurai, facing a heavy rain of bullets, rushed right into the imperial forces like they had a personal grudge against anyone who thought guns were superior to swords. They moved with a sharp accuracy, their blades slicing through the air, and unfortunately for the imperial soldiers, slicing through their lines too. The Imperials, relying on their rifles to handle everything, suddenly came up against fighters who had dedicated their lives to mastering close combat. The disciplined ranks fell apart with soldiers running in all directions, some even leaving their weapons behind to scream and flee. For a bit, it really seemed like the samurai could make something cool happen. They were shredding anyone brave enough to stand their ground. But even though they were completely fearless, the reality was still pretty apparent. The Imperials had more soldiers, more weapons, and were less likely to play by the rules. Saigo's lines, though intimidating, started to dwindle. The samurai, facing more enemies and stronger weapons, had to pull back. But in the end, they made sure the Imperial troops would remember them for a long time. And before the last battle, Saigo did what any honorable leader would do when they knew they were about to be defeated. He took his own life. Yup, he decided to impale himself in the stomach instead of dealing with the shame of being caught. Let's take a moment of silence for the fallen soldiers. Just kidding, a few seconds are enough. Let's move on. The Battle of Pasir Panjang, February 13th, 1942. A little mismatched team of soldiers from different Commonwealth forces thought they could fight the whole Japanese military. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. But it's a cool story. Unbeknownst to the Commonwealth soldiers, the Japanese had managed to move a tank past all of their barriers, which disrupted some things, and in the middle of all this confusion, there was a group led by Second Lieutenant Adnan bin Saidi, a Malay soldier who said, you know what, let's try it, even though it seems like we shouldn't. And you know what they were going to try? He and his group, made up of a few dozen soldiers, decided to try to hold the Pasir Panjang Ridge, one of the most important defensive spots in all of Singapore. So here's the deal. Pasir Panjang is a raised area, and it's tough to keep control of a raised area when you're facing an army with tanks, big guns, and a huge number of troops. But he figured why not give it a shot. The Japanese, known for their effectiveness, began their invasion of Pasir Panjang with full force. And by full force, I mean everything. Tanks, soldiers, the entire deal, all coming up the hill to attack. The Commonwealth forces, on the other hand, had barely enough firepower to fill a squirt gun. But it seems like the size of the army wasn't what really counted. It was about how courageously you could face an approaching steamroller. And you know what? They stood. Adnan and his men stood firm against the Japanese forces for hours, firing from the trenches. The Japanese were advancing steadily, but what about the Commonwealth troops? They fought like their whole lives were on the line, because, surprise, they were. Even though they were outnumbered and facing many challenges, Adnan and his team were able to keep control of the ridge for hours. They used everything they could find, guns, bombs, rocks, you name it. Adnan was fighting back hard to try to push the Japanese away from his land, and the Japanese were determined. No level of courage was about to hold them back from moving over the ridge. Eventually, Adnan's situation became impossible. The Japanese had him surrounded and the men had no way to win. So after hours of fighting, they finally gave up. This fight was insane though. They were facing impossible odds and they still held out against a much larger force for so long. People say you can only stretch so much before you snap, but Adnan was like, nah, I'm fine. And in the end, he was killed by the enemy, because that's just how it went in war. It's October 14th, 1066, and you're on the wet, chilly battlefield of Hastings, about to witness the most intense, final, brave but hopeless fight in British history. The Saxons, led by King Harold II, are up against William the Conqueror's Norman troops. The Normans have better armor, better weapons, and a clearer idea of how to win a battle. Things are not looking good. So what was this really about? Harold was going through a tough year. First, there was that small fight with the Vikings at Stamford Bridge, where he had to face an army that wasn't very keen on dying. But fine, whatever. Harold handled it thinking, hey, I just saved England. But no, here comes William, the Duke of Normandy, who also wanted England. Harold, who was already feeling really tired from the battles he'd fought, both in his mind and his body, had to pull together what was left of his army for another fight, this time against a stronger and more organized group of Norman soldiers. Harold wasn't a fool. He understood that battles were not going to be simple. In the end, the Normans had knights riding horses, archers, and the rather intense tactic of shooting arrows at you from really far away. And at the same time, the Saxons had housecarls, men who were really skilled at standing close together and holding their shields while getting poked at over and over. So the chances weren't great, but someone needed to protect the kingdom, and Harold thought, what's the worst that could happen? We're not going to lose the entire kingdom or anything like that. The fight starts, and Harold's Saxons stand together in their shield wall formation. A shield wall is just a way to defend yourself by standing close to your friends, holding up a shield, and hoping that everything turns out okay. The Normans, meanwhile, are over there thinking, this should be fun, and start shooting arrows at the Saxon shield wall like it's just a game. The fight went on for a long time, with the Saxons staying strong, taking blow after blow, and standing their ground. Meanwhile, William's troops continue their actions, firing, rushing in, and gradually breaking down the Saxon defenses with all the grace of a young child banging a toy against a wall. Now here's the best part of the day. King Harold, a guy who really seemed to have all the bad luck, gets hit by an arrow right in the eye. And when I say right in the eye, I mean right in the eye. At that moment, Harold probably thought this wasn't scheduled and did what any decent medieval king would do, said something like, that's just typical, and then collapsed. He was dead. But Harold's death didn't stop the Saxon fight. Oh no, it improved. Or worsened, depending on your viewpoint. The remaining Saxon housecarls, who were the top bodyguards and loyal warriors of Harold, chose to stand by their fallen king no matter what. They surrounded his corpse, thinking, okay, Harold's gone, but we're going out in style. The dudes fought bravely till the very end. Ultimately, the Normans came out on top, because when the leader gets hit and everyone else decides to give up, the army is pretty likely to break down. But they didn't go down quietly. As the housecarls fought bravely to the last man around Harold's body, they said, we're not just gonna quit because Harold's gone, we're gonna make you work for this win even if it takes all day. And it really took the whole day. It's very impressive to see how much dedication they had to the dead king. Alright, now we're talking about Lachit Borpikon. Let's set the scene. Assam, India. It's 1671 and the Mughal Emperor, which was busy trying to take over every part of the subcontinent, thought, hey, Assam seemed like a great place to invade. They had no idea that they would face Lachit Borpikon, the leader of the Ahom army. Now, this is where it becomes fun. Lachit wasn't in the best shape when the Mughals showed up. Think of the worst flu you've ever experienced, and then mix in a dangerous war, and that's what Lachit was facing.